All right, so let's talk about writing your research paper.
A lot of you will find that you may be great writers, but maybe you don't necessarily have the skill set yet developed for professional and academic writing. I mean, it's being able to write creatively and being able to write some very well constructed sentences doesn't always necessarily equate to the skill of being able to organize your thoughts and your evidence in such a way to write professionally and academically. And again, that doesn't make you a bad writer if that's the case. It just means that there's a new type of writing, and the other stuff is good too. It's like it just makes you a more diverse writer. There's a great thing of being able to write an awesome letter to the editor, or to write a good essay, or a good story, or a good letter to your congressperson, or whatever. Those are different kinds of writing than writing for an academic or a professional audience. It's a learning process. You come come here to be educated, and it is a humbling process. And I've learned what you have learned. And that is what happens. You break down, whatever it is, in terms of your writing skills or, your body of knowledge, and then you have to rebuild and start that all over again. And that's what education sometimes is all about. Most people don't write like this, okay? So please don't treat it like, oh, I already knew that, because it's a good chance that, I want you to start thinking about writing like this anyway. If you knew it, refresh your memory, go back into it, think about structuring your writing in this way. The way I'm going to go through this basically is I'm going to define for you the different elements of a research paper, but I'm also going to present it in an outline fashion so as to help you be able to organize that information. Nearly all academic papers are set up in a certain order, in a certain way, and it's done that way in order to communicate very clearly, what its intentions are in a professional way anyway. So I guess the first thing we need to talk about is sort of what's an outline. I apologize if some of these questions may seem a little bit obvious for you, but again, I think I might have said this to you guys before. I've experienced a lot of people who have come into various Baker programs, and even by the time they're done, they're still struggling with some of this stuff. And certainly by the time they're at the beginning, they just don't know. And so, part of the reason this class is here is to try to get everybody up to speed. And so some of you are like, dude, I learned that when I was in junior high. And, but still, it's at least worth a refresher, I guess. We'll at least call it that. An outline is an organized list of your supporting ideas. It's a great way to organize a research paper, or any sort of paper, honestly. And creating an outline can help you stay focused on your topic, include all the major points, present these points in a logical manner. And as I said before, I'm going to give you a structure, and I suggest that you use this structure to try to help you organize the information that you will then eventually convert to the draft. Now, how do you create an outline? I would say, first of all, you want to identify the primary topic of your paper, jot down the major points you want to include in the paper, organize the points in the order you'll present and discuss them, expand each point with additional bullet points that support the points. But this is one thing I really want to say that's, particularly important and maybe not obvious, because I see this so much, is don't just take a whole bunch of information and dump it in the body of your paper and just kind of leave it there, right? Each paragraph should be organized so it creates a reason to support your thesis or serve the purpose of that section of the paper. And you can't just sort of throw quotes and stuff onto a page in order to meet the page limit, okay? But one of the biggest problems is that there's a tendency for people just to find a whole bunch of information and just sort of dump it on the page. And if it's relevant to their topic, then they kind of organize it, but it doesn't really have a plan, it doesn't have a scheme, it doesn't have a direction. And you kind of wonder, do they need this here? Is this essential? Well, they're not telling me, they're not proving to me it's essential. It seems sort of like out there. So you want to organize this in a way so that your professor hopefully knows that you know how to write.
I encourage you guys to use title headings as you write your research paper. As you can see from journal articles, they tend to have these things. It's not just like one big block of text with no breaks whatsoever. When you're writing something that's, substantially long, I think it's helpful anyway for you to be able to break that up in sort of to logical subheadings anyway. So I would do that.
Each major point in your outline should be converted to a title heading. except the introduction. You know, obviously you can have a number one that's an introduction, right? But generally speaking, and I'm sure you guys have seen that in most of the articles you looked at, they don't generally have a title heading above the first few paragraphs that constitute the introduction. Sometimes it happens, but usually not. But I think it's a good idea for you guys to use title headings. It will help to break up your paper a little bit, to help it flow. It helps communicate to the reader what the major points are, where you are in this academic outline. So, you know, you definitely want to do it. It's long enough that it definitely justifies you having some headings throughout. I also would say don't use the titles that I've included in the syllabus, things like methodology, things like evidence. I guess you could use methodology if you want to, you know, but you can also be more creative than some of this, right? Usually they don't say literature review when they get to literature review. They actually sort of use a phrase that's, I don't know, more clever or creative that actually summarizes their particular literature review. So, you know, use subheadings to divide your paper along the lines of the outline that I'm getting ready to share with you, but you don't necessarily have to. In fact, I would encourage you to use alternative titles that are specific to your paper, right? Now, the major areas, the sort of outline of the major areas are summarized right here. But as opposed to explaining each of them here, I'm going to go through these sort of point by point and try to explain that to you anyway as we go along.
What do you want in an introduction? Well, within that first paragraph or that first few paragraphs, you want to do the following. You want to introduce the issue. You want to explain why a reader should be interested. You know, sometimes a puzzle is a good way to sort of introduce your paper. You know, let's say, I'm going to pretend like we're in an international business class, for example, but let's say that, you know, the conventional wisdom suggests that free trade is awesome and works absolutely everywhere, but somehow you found this particular case where protectionist policies seem to be really great for one reason or another. Well, that's an interesting puzzle. If it seems to work one way every place else, why is it not working that way here? You know, you put that kind of a puzzle logic in your introduction, it grabs people's attention and it illustrates why your paper might have something interesting or cool or new to prove, to demonstrate. So that's one strategy you can use anyway to explain why your reader should be interested, why it's important. You want to offer your research question. What is your research question? You should probably either say it or imply it, anyway, so they know what you're researching. This is what we're talking about. You want to declare your thesis. And again, let's review the main things that we want to make sure we have in a thesis statement. It advances a hypothesis that can be compared with evidence to other hypotheses and basically answers the research question, right? It expresses the central idea of your paper.
Where should the thesis be? Okay, somewhere in the introduction, okay?
It usually appears in the first paragraph of your paper, generally as the first or last sentence, or some other prominent place in the introduction, right? You've got to clearly know when you've gotten to it. And most of the examples you'll find, usually the last sentence of the introduction is a good place to put it.
I mean, I've seen it sometimes where somebody makes a thesis statement the very first sentence, and then and especially if it's sort of a bold thing, like, wow, okay, what's all that? It's a great way to get people's attention. Then you spend the next paragraph or two of your introduction explaining, like, why am I saying this, and what is it that I'm trying to prove? You know, especially if it's like kind of a cool puzzle, kind of a question or thesis, right? It's a good way to start.
And remember, I know I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, right? Not writing a mystery novel. Do not save your thesis for the end of the paper. Boy, if you guys do, man, oh my gosh. I feel like a broken record, if you know what that is.
I can see a white broken record.
In academic and professional writing, you need to clearly state what you intend to prove at the beginning, or you lose your readers. It is not a question. Okay? Research question is a question. This is an answer, right? It consists of one clear sentence, no more, no less. And yes, it does sort of provide an answer to this hypothesis or this question. Poses an argument. It's not an informative paper. You intend to prove something that is not obvious. Okay? All the things we've already talked about. So hopefully we won't have to talk about that really a whole lot more. Again, explain why your answer is important or unique.
At some point, I have to convince somebody who's reading this that they're not wasting their time. That I actually am, you know, providing something that's an interesting insight or a new insight. Why is this like the most important, coolest thing ever that I'm writing about? Even if you don't believe it, you got to make your reader believe it, okay? Now, you're going to get some assignments in this program you're not going to like, and you're like, oh, God, this is so boring. But you got to make somebody believe that it's the most important thing ever, okay? That's your job.
Finally, I would say at the end of an introduction, it is useful to have a transitional paragraph in there somewhere. Something that sort of says, what I will be doing in this paper is this.
You want to have some nice transitions. You want to try to explain to them sort of what it is that you will be doing in your paper. You've got your introduction, then, and your thesis is somewhere toward the end of the introduction, and then you probably have a break with a subheading, and there's your lit review right there. Usually a literature review is situated like it's the first thing you see once the thesis is done. What a literature review is basically is, in any academic paper, the people who are writing it are going to tell you how it is that this question or this thesis fits into the bigger literature that's out there, okay? And they're going to do this basically by talking about the debates that are happening about this issue. So they're spending some time saying, this is what these scholars said, and this is what these scholars said. They're reviewing the literature, right? They're talking about what other academics, what other smart people who gather data have to say. You're going to take your own research question, and in this research question, you're going to say, how have other people answered this question? What that's going to require you guys to do as you're writing your papers is to do some research and find out what experts are saying about whatever your topic is. You're not arguing something out of left field, okay? You're working within the constraints of the previous work that's being done. So you find out what it is that they say. These people say that they would answer this question this way. These people say they would answer this question this way. The things that are included in a literature review are summarized up here, right? To what theoretical concepts does your topic relate? What general knowledge do we have about the topic? To what extent would your thesis support or challenge what we know about the topic? What are competing hypotheses or competing arguments, right? You remember we talked about those competing arguments earlier. What would, which ones disagree with your thesis? What do experts say about your argument? And about those arguments that are contrary to yours. And one thing that's really important is you give the best possible spin on all of those answers. As I think I've said before, you're not out here to grind an axe. This isn't about your opinion. It's not about what you think. It's about all of the different ways that you might answer the question. And so you need to be fair in your portrayal of all of those other alternatives. If you want to organize a literature review, there's several ways you can do it, but this is sort of a suggestion on how I might do it if it was an outline structure. What are the different answers to your research question, and organize your literature review around that. So you want to include any information that, first of all, it's necessary for a basic understanding of your topic. You see some literature reviews where they start off with some definitions. You may want to include some of that, just so people understand what it is that you're talking about. And you need to be succinct. You need to get to the point. You don't want to talk about Asian China, okay? I've had some people, who are writing international business papers on doing business in China, and, next thing you know, I get like 6 pages on the Ming Dynasty, okay? Yes, ma'am?
How do you know when you're talking about China at this point? Like, how do you know that you've gone... Yeah.
That is a great question.
When you're not just padding the paper.
Okay. The answer is, if you're not sure whether you're padding the paper or not, then you need to be able to explain why this is important to advancing your argument. And if you can't do that, then you're padding the paper. Always ask why. Why do I have this here? Do I need this here? If I don't need this here, then get rid of it. But if I do, then I really need to be able to prove to somebody that this is why it's here.
Okay.
It's interesting, that's great, but you gotta really focus on the things that are absolutely important, okay? Just focus on those things that allow the reader to know what they need to know so that they can follow you through this literature review and understand what you're talking about. So below that then, you're going to say, okay, what's the first answer to this research question? And what's wrong with that first answer, right? What's the second answer? And what's right or wrong with that, okay? There may be 3 answers, there may be 2 answers, there may be 6 answers, whatever it is that your literature says. But what you really do need to think about, are what are the multiple causes of the things you're trying to explain? How do the experts answer this question? Because their chances are there's not just one way, there's several ways. What's the best way to enter market? Why? Well, maybe there's a
an X1 and X2 and an X3 different way, well, if you're doing a lit review and you're doing that sort of a paper, you're going to want to bring up 1, 2, and 3 and talk about which one, what the strengths and weaknesses of all of those are before you start using some real evidence to bear on which of those 3 you think is probably the most reasonable explanation or the most reasonable strategy or the most reasonable answer.
But that's kind of what you're doing, is you're saying, these people say this, and here's what's cool about what they have to say, and here's some problems with it. And these people say this, and here's, some gaps over here or whatever, right? And all along you're explaining how that relates back to your answer to the question, right? How does your answer fit into these answers? How do they support it? How does yours challenge it? So you want to sort of end up with sort of a synthesis and analytical discussion about what it is that you're having to say in the middle of all this. Now, next I'm going to talk about evidence. Now, that really isn't the next point on the outline, but I think it's important to talk about this first because understanding evidence will help you understand what is the next point on the outline, which is methodology. So let's talk about what's involved here. This section, the evidence section, is sort of one of the really big parts of your paper. You're presenting evidence to support your thesis statement. And what you're hoping to do is try to explain how your thesis statement works in the real world. For some of these academics, the real world involves talking to real work groups. That's very real world, right? For you guys, it might involve, looking at some businesses and how they do whatever it is you're talking about. Doing some general searches on the Collins Library website to try to find answers in that way. Who knows? But you're trying to connect what it is that you're trying to prove with some real world data, something that really happened, that will illustrate what it is that you're talking about. And so you're looking for what evidence supports your thesis. And I would say, a couple of things you could consider are case studies or statistics. Well, where do I get statistics? There's a lot of great places to go. There's data that's hosted on in government agencies' websites. Professors oftentimes have vast resources of databases, stuff they mine themselves. So, if you want to work with numbers, you can find numbers. There's a couple of ways that I would suggest you get case studies. One is to maybe go to peer-reviewed journals and look at some of their cases. Now, you don't want this to be a book review when you're writing your paper. You don't want to just sort of summarize exactly what they did in the way that they did it, right? You want to offer something, at least some original form of analysis on what they did, even if you're not coming up with original evidence. The other really good thing I think to look at potentially is case studies. Textbooks sometimes have case studies. I wouldn't use the text to cite, but I would go to those original sources that they looked at. And in your evidence section, you're telling a story. You're sort of saying, here's the argument, and here's how the argument played out in real life. Look at 2 or 3 different cases of 2 or 3 different businesses or something. And build it up. Say, spend a couple of pages talking about IBM or talking about, Yahoo or Google or whatever. Let's talk about criteria and methodology. Criteria is not the same thing as evidence, right? Evidence is the stuff that you gather, like when you ask people questions, or the case studies that you go through. You go out to the internet or Baker Collins Library and you say, hey, let's talk about Sprint or let's talk about GM or whatever. That's evidence, okay? And the methodology and the criteria are the tools you're using to objectively analyze that stuff. When you think about literature review, you're thinking about what everybody else has said in the past, okay? When you're talking about methods or criteria, you're talking about what am I doing on this study, this time, right now? How can you more objectively prove and take apart and analyze something in a way that, isn't just sort of based on your opinion and your subjective assessment of whatever it is you read. This isn't really about what you think, okay? This is about trying to take these terms and identifying them with more objective criteria. Get on the internet and you find a bunch of quotes from people who agree or disagree with you and who's got the most quotes or who's got the best quotes or, here's a statistic I found from the New York Times that sort of says what I'm supposed to say, so I'll throw it in there, okay? That's cool, right? That's fine. This is a little more systematic than that. These quotes could be from anybody. The statistics could come from anywhere. So how do you know that this information that you're gathering is proving the point that you intend to prove? You pretty much want to define whatever is important in your thesis statement, what your independent variables are. As I've said before, I think you don't need to use a dictionary. You want to use academic or professional sources, whereas dictionaries sort of speak in common parlance.
They aren't dictionary definitions, okay? These are definitions of things that people have used before to effectively measure. So if they want to compare what they've done to what everybody else has done, they're not comparing apples and oranges, right? They're using exactly the same sorts of terms and exactly the same sorts of variables measured in as close to the same way as they possibly can. Let's take every word that's in our thesis, everything that we think we want to prove, and we're going to give it a name, we're going to give it a definition, and we're going to show you how we're going to measure it. Okay? So these aren't just words on a page now, right? These are words that can be associated with, numbers, things that you can measure. Let's say that you want to prove that experienced work groups handle external challenges better than inexperienced ones. How do you define experienced? When you look at your cases, do they meet your definition?
As the example I used before, you're defining team sizes as a certain number of people. You're defining a participation in a certain way. You're defining experience. These broad, abstract terms, you're making them real somehow so that you can use information to measure them. And so that's part of what you're doing in a methodology. But also you're saying, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. Are you going out and interviewing people? Are you looking up different business case studies? Or are you using something statistical where you're running numbers and creating a correlation and trying to find out if something's meaningful, if these two variables are happening at the same time? Okay? These are things that you want to explain as you're setting up your paper. So that's really the purpose of the methodology.
In your methodology, you also want to explain why you've selected these cases. You establish a set of criteria or information that you're actively looking for in your cases or data, and then construct a set of questions that help you determine whether or not the criteria has been satisfied by the cases. Ask yourself, some things that you might ask yourself as you think about these questions. What do these cases have in common? What are you learning from them? What are their common findings? What approaches do they have in common? And then you construct a set of questions that are going to help you come up with specific answers that help you compare these cases and come up with a solid set of answers. And explicitly put these questions in your methodology. These are the questions that I am going to ask as I go through and analyze these cases. And then when you ultimately analyze them, then you'll have answers to them. You could do a study or a survey based on several different journals and sort of say, okay, what do these have in common? That would be one great question to ask. Like, what do these things have in common? What can I learn or derive from all of these different cases that I can learn? You also have to make sure that you're not just reiterating and doing a book review on what everybody else did. Now, you don't have to engage in statistical analysis. What I do expect you to do is ask some intelligent questions based on whatever case studies or data or information it is that you do gather. Some systematic questions that will help you try to cut through the data, right? So you're wanting to explain sort of, what kind of evidence are you looking for? How will you know that you've seen, or how will you know you've answered the questions correctly? That it actually satisfies your thesis. So it's not an easy thing to do, but you're doing more than just sort of assuming that you got enough evidence. You're explaining why you got enough evidence and how you got the correct kind of evidence, okay? So you're trying to qualify that in some important ways, or quantify it if you're dealing with statistics. The methodology section typically comes before evidence, so this is maybe at least a point 3 perhaps on an outline. What would you include in this? Well, first of all, how are you going to answer the question? What terms need definition? What data or set of cases have you chosen? Why have you chosen those cases? What do these cases or the data set have in common? And I would say also, what do you hope to discover from looking at this data? What questions will you ask in order to derive these answers? Now, maybe not every one of these things is going to be appropriate for your particular approach. I don't know. I can't say. But I'm just giving you some ideas, some things that I think would be helpful for you anyway, to try to figure out how to answer questions like this, how to analyze the data that you've got. And then we talked about what evidence was, but like I said, that's the next section. So how would you organize a section like this in outline form? Well, you might present statistics if that's what you're doing, or the findings from those statistics, or you present your first case. Here's a case of You know, what happened with this business during Hurricane Katrina, or how this institution failed, right? It's a story, it's a case that explains something that proves whatever your thesis is supposed to do. You offer some support. And then you got case number 2, and case number 3. You kind of do it, you know, based on each individual case, if that's the case study approach. Then the next section, I would say, basically involves some analysis. So you've got your methodology, you've got your evidence. Now you're trying to explain to your reader what it is that you got out of it. How does it actually support the thesis that you set forward? So you want to organize it based on the reasons your reader should believe your argument. You want to answer the questions posed in your criteria section and explain how your cases and data fulfill that criteria. And you want to use examples from the cases and data to support the reasons why your argument's valid. If you're organizing an analysis section, think about it in an organized paragraph sort of form. You know, the first reason your thesis is valid, and then you offer the supporting data with the evidence, right? Here's the second reason. So you're offering a sequence of reasons why the information that you presented offers some degree of merit to the thesis. And then we have the qualifier. What you need to do at your level, and I think this is true at any level, is you need to establish what criteria you think is reasonable for you to meet in order to try to make that proof. You make the definitions and you establish the criteria. And then when you get to the caveats at the end of your paper, then you basically say, look, this is the criteria that I had, and this is the information that I had to work with, and so this is what my conclusion is. However, it doesn't take into account all this other stuff. So you might have quite a few more caveats. You might have a little bit more explaining to do, okay? But you can, at this level, you know, it would be enough for me, and certainly for any instructor out there, to simply be able to say, I'm seriously thinking about this criteria, and I am establishing this criteria, and I'm trying to meet it to the best of my ability, and this is how I made it, and this is how I didn't make it.
How does your evidence outweigh the most valid arguments on the opposing side? Okay? If it doesn't, where does that leave your argument? You know, and again, like I said, you need to be pretty clear about what it is that you think you can prove and can't prove. You need to state that. You need to be explicit about that.
Data is vulnerable to manipulation, absolutely. But you have to make sure that, you know, you say what you think the data says based on what you've set up, and that you clearly say what you have not proven, what you cannot prove. And what's cool about that is that in academia, and the same as in the business community as well, is that, you know, if you, whatever it is you didn't prove, that's for somebody else to go check out. No article, no paper is going to solve all your problems and answer all your questions, any more than a business plan is going to accurately predict every obstacle you're possibly going to cross, and, you know, accurately predict what your costs are going to be. And, you know, I mean, you're making assumptions about things, and you're applying the data to a model and hoping that you're going to get it right.
You know, what's the likelihood that you're right? How well have you met your criteria?
Right, you've had this literature review earlier, and you found all this new cool stuff. Well, did you win? If you didn't win, in what ways did you lose? You know, to what extent are they right? And if they're partially right, well, where does that leave you? Does that mean that your argument's still valid? Does it still have merit? Is there still something important to it? We talked before about how it's important not to overstate your case. This doesn't have to be a slam dunk, I think is what I said before. You just have to state what it is that you can prove with the information you've got. You will probably have limited data sets, a limited sample of case studies. You will not be able to have probably enough to say 100% without any question that, you know, you're right about this. This is your opportunity to share those sorts of concerns based on sample size or bias or whatever, right? In other words, when you write your papers, I don't have to be 100% right 100% of the time. I'm not here to sort of like prove to you that you should believe me, okay? I'm just telling you that this is what I found, but here are some assumptions that I made, and here are some potential problems, and so if you come up with something different, maybe you can, you know, figure this out differently, right? Fair enough. But you're telling people just up front, like, this is why my work isn't perfect. Like in your cases, it'd be like, okay, well, you know, I just looked at 3 cases. You know, what can I draw from 3 cases? Okay, I can't totally generalize about it, but I do see a pattern that's consistent with what other people have found. Okay? It's worth saying that. You can say that in your papers.
And it's okay to say, I don't know. It's okay to say they don't know, right? You know, you're not publishing, but even if you are publishing, you know, you should still specify what you know and what you don't know. There isn't enough evidence as a valid argument. Well, if this is the case, change your thesis. You know, you should attempt to prove that.
You know, you wouldn't necessarily have to introduce like a new set of information or data, I think, you know, for a class or a program like this. You could reject whatever it is that's being said, but of course you'd have to do so with evidence based on what you've found. So a section on a qualifier would probably A, explain the limitations of your evidence and analysis. B, explain why your argument might still be valid. Then we have the, at long last, the conclusion. What did we learn from your paper?
Explain how your argument is valid and or sound. How does your analysis support your central argument?
Why is it important? By the time people go to bed that night, you want them to like know that it mattered. They haven't wasted their time. Some of you guys are worried about page length. By the time you're done doing all this, man, you guys should have no problem. The final section is the works cited and notes. Now, I would say works cited is actually the name of the section, but the notes pertain to the parenthetical notations that you may have throughout that, of course, need to be MLA formats. And the source material, quotes and notations, have to follow proper MLA formatting, be properly integrated in the paper. Everything that's in the works cited should also appear in parenthetical notations elsewhere in the paper, too. Okay, not everybody knows that or thinks about that, right? But if you've got something in your bibliography, you should actually be referring to it somewhere in your paper. And if you're not, then you just don't need it. It's interesting, but not necessary. I know this stuff seems very abstract at times, right? But it's that kind of abstract thinking that really does matter in a practical sense if you're able to convert that into the real world. There's going to be a time, I guarantee, one point or another, where people are going to be presenting data to you. They're going to be presenting information to you. And it's going to be somebody up there who knows a whole lot more about stats than you do. Businesses make decisions based on a bunch of pinhead dudes that grind numbers all the time who come in there and say, this is how we're going to do this, and here's why, and it's up on the big board. Look at the numbers. And you got to be able to say, yeah, it's a good idea, or no, it's a stupid idea. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of organizing your thoughts. It's a way of trying to understand how stuff goes together so that you can manipulate and challenge and use data, and, you know, if you're ambitious enough, you can go out and do some of it yourself too.